Good morning and good afternoon. My name is Jeff Tucker, CEO of Tucker Company Worldwide, and we are here for 15 minutes this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are. And we are pleased to have Larry Gross with us. Larry is an economist that follows very closely and is well regarded as an intermodal expert. So wanted to introduce Larry to our group. We've got a 15 minutes presentation by Larry, and then we're going to go 15 minutes of up to 15 minutes of Q&A. So we will be done 12:30 Eastern, 9:30 Pacific. And Larry, tell us where we can find more of your information. I know it's at the end, but where can we find more about you?
Well, thanks, Jeff, and thanks for having me on. And I'm looking forward to being able to chat with the listeners here. But one small correction: I'm no economist. I'm just a lowly analyst that has some 40 plus years of experience in the intermodal business, that crazy business. So I can be reached at lgross, Gross, at intermodalindepth.com. That is my company website. I put out a monthly report called Intermodal In Depth, and you can also see me on Twitter. I have the handle Intermodalist. So that is how folks can reach me, and happy to answer any questions that might arise out of this presentation. So just a few minutes. My job here today, I guess, is to give you a little bit of a visibility on what's happening on the intermodal side right now. And of course, intermodal has had a very, very difficult time during this post-pandemic surge, particularly from a capacity and from a service standpoint. And we now have the benefit here of the latest data from Intermodal Association of North America, or IANA. They have a monthly database that they put out called the ETSO database, Equipment Type, Size, and Ownership. And what that's measuring is revenue moves across the North American intermodal system. And we use the equipment type to divide that into two sectors: the international sector, which is ISO containers, 20s, 40s, and 45s, and that's what's seen here in blue. And then the balance, which are 53-foot domestic containers plus what remains of TOFC, is shown in green. And what we're looking at here are the monthly revenue moves of those two sectors on this left-hand chart, measuring off of the right-hand axis, and then the red is the total intermodal activity, which measures off of the left-hand axis. And you can see that we saw a steady decline in the IPI, or inland point intermodal or international activity, that ran all the way through the, let's say, the latter part of 2021, cratering in November. And now we've seen quite a significant uptick here in March. The green, the international, was more constant. What was really happening there was that, at least on the domestic side, we were equipment limited. And so even though there might have been more demand for domestic container activity, we didn't really have the capacity to accommodate it. But now we have a lot of equipment flowing into the system. And so it looks like that's starting to have an effect in March. And you can see on this right-hand side, here are the year-over-year comparisons. And domestic has been in the black here for the last 2 months. Not terrifically large surplus here in March, about 3%, whereas on the international side, we're still deep in the hole with roughly a 14% year-over-year deficit. Now, one of the things I want to caution you at, and here's that asterisk, is a lot of this big jump that we're seeing from February to March is due to calendar effect, and simply the fact that March had more calendar days in it, more working days, 3 more working days, about as many as you can, as a larger difference from month to month as you can have. And so the gain that we saw in March, in reality, in terms of the pace, was not nearly as large as the monthly figures would indicate. And what this analysis does is this takes every month and takes the number of working days. So we're taking into account here holidays. We're taking into account weekend effect. And what you can see here is a little bit of a different pattern where the recovery actually started earlier, but has not been nearly as acute here in March. Looks like on the international side, we started to see the recovery, a slow recovery, beginning back all the way back in December. And on the domestic side, it bottomed out here in January, and we've seen a slow recovery since then. So the March jump was a lot due to a calendar effect, and not so much due to actual larger amount of activity. Now, when you look at intermodal, North American intermodal, probably 60% of it is going to be involved in some form or fashion with import-export cargo flows. 50% is just a straight movement of ISO containers, so that's obviously import-export. And then of the 50% that's in domestic, a good chunk of it, probably 20% of that, is transloaded import cargo moving in 53-foot boxes. So what happens at the ports is really very important. And the good news here is that it looks like, particularly on the West Coast, we're starting to see a higher degree of throughput through these congested West Coast terminals. And they have learned their lesson, I think, in terms of not letting the terminal get too congested. The carriers have moved a lot of empties out. And in general, it looks like the volume is flowing through in a more reasonable fashion. And you can see it particularly on the West Coast, that these numbers have been stepping up steadily since the end of last year, which is basically, since there is essentially unlimited demand, there are ships still floating out there. This is a measure of the operational capabilities of the ports and the inland links that go from the ports. So we've definitely seen some improvement there. One of the questions that has been posed lately is, what's the effect going to be of these lockdowns that are occurring now in China? And my contention is that as long as we have queues of ships on both coasts, the effects are going to be basically invisible in terms of the North American situation, because all what that means is that ships and Shanghai originating cargo are going to be late entering the queue. But until these queues disappear, then in effect, there won't really be much impact to the North American situation. The Shanghai freight will just be later entering the queue, and we'll see a surge perhaps when Shanghai opens back up, and that will mean that queue will lengthen out a little bit more. But until we actually manage to eliminate the queues, I don't really see a lot of effect there. Let's see if we can get this slide to advance. There we go. We are seeing some service issues. This has been a chronic problem here during the recovery. Right now, the railroads are still suffering from a lack of a sufficient number of crews. We don't have a lot of great intermodal statistics to look at, but here are some that are put out by the Surface Transportation Board. One is average intermodal train speeds, and you can see that red line that we're at a very low point here relative to previous years. And in particular, I'll draw your attention to the dotted blue line, which is the average train speed across all of North America for intermodal trains over the last 5 years. And we're running fairly considerably below that. A couple of other measures that the STB have also in problematic territory. One on the left here is the number of trains that are being held, either for lack of crew, lack of locomotives, or for some other reason. And that number is at a very high level, as you see on the on that left-hand chart on the red line. And the other is the number of loaded intermodal rail cars that haven't moved in 48 hours or more. And you can see that's at an elevated level as well. So these are indications that at least the rail line haul network is in some difficulty. And then, of course, you have all of the issues that are occurring in the terminals, which are not captured in these measures, but certainly we are having plenty of evidence of problems. Another piece of the intermodal equation is the dray situation. We have a unique measure here called the Drayage Demand Index that I put together with my friend Jason Hilsenbeck of LoadMatch and Drayage.com. And what we're measuring here are the number of clicks that are are being made in various markets looking for dray services. And just to give you some context, we don't have time to go into this in any great depth, but based on previous years, 100 is normal. So here we are up in the stratosphere with an overall demand index for 21 markets in North America of 600, and places like New York, we're up in the 1200 range, which is just crazy, but just basically an indication that the market's in somewhat of a state of a meltdown. Here's the situation on the left in LA Long Beach, which is stable at a very, very high level. Not nearly as bad here in an inland location, key inland location like Chicago, with a most recent reading of 238, which is high, but not stratospherically high. Intermodal market share has suffered during these service issues, and you can see that here. Left-hand chart in green is domestic, right-hand chart is the international IPI. And we've seen a big plunge. Looks like now, as of first quarter, things are starting to improve on the domestic side, stabilized on the international side, but we have a long way to go here for happiness. So just to tie it up here, in terms of an outlook, my expectation is that 2022 is going to start to look more normal from a seasonal perspective. We've got a lot of equipment flowing in on the domestic container side. Between last year and this year, private domestic container operators are going to add something like 55,000 boxes. This is a very significant percentage increase, where the pacing item is going to be, in terms of capacity from equipment standpoint, is going to be on the chassis side. And in particular, domestic 53-foot chassis, because all of those now have to be sourced domestically. The China option is no longer on the table because of the ruling last year that they were dumping equipment in at non-compensatory prices. So there's been a punitive tariff put on. So now it's all up to the domestic manufacturers, and they're trying to spool up production, but they're having the same kind of supply issues that all the other manufacturers are having. So that's going to be the pacing item. We talked about the share losses. I think that where we are right now is a little bit overdone. We'll see some recovery back to what was a more typical level here as we go on through the year. IPI is in a deep hole, and it's not going to come all the way back to where it was. Ocean carrier container shortage, when that eases, we'll see some benefit there. But we also are seeing a lot of west to east shift of cargo, and that's not great from an intermodal standpoint. It's because the intermodal share off the East Coast is lower than it is off the West Coast. So with that here, Jeff, we're exactly at 15 minutes after the hour. Here's my shameless self-promotional slide. We put out a really deep data dive on intermodal every month, called Intermodal In Depth, along with weekly flash updates every Wednesday when the AAR numbers come out. If any of your listeners have a interest in really understanding what's happening in intermodal on an ongoing basis, we would love to add them to the list, to our subscriber family, and they can try it as an individual subscription for 6 months for $200. So we would love to see folks joining with us, and they can do that at intermodalindepth.com. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Jeff.
All right, thank you so much. Yeah, wow, you finished on time. Thank you for that.
Well, I'm doing better than Intermodal is doing right now.
That's exactly right. Well done. Thank you. And I've known Larry for a long time. I can't remember how many years, but a really long time.
Longer than we both want to admit.
That's exactly right. Yeah, we have some questions here. One of the questions, Larry, with the war in Ukraine going on and fuel prices increasing, and the likelihood that the U.S. is going to be producing a lot more oil in the coming days, what impact are we expecting on rail over the next few months, years, maybe? Is there any thought?
Well, I mean, certainly high fuel prices are a tailwind for intermodal because it is a more fuel efficient mode than truck. So but I think that the impact of that has been somewhat overstated. It is a tailwind. It definitely helps intermodal when fuel prices go up, but it's not the be all and end all. And intermodal is very important that intermodal gets its service house in order here, because it will thrive if it offers a decent package to the shipper. It's slower, it's a little bit more complicated, it's a little bit less reliable, it needs to be less expensive. If it's just a little bit less reliable and less expensive, that's going to work. But if, when you have the kind of difficulties that we've had in recent months, then it gets to be a very tough sell. So from a standpoint of recovery, adding capacity and getting the operations back in line are more important than fuel. Now you will see, I think, some additional, fuel crude by rail movements coming onto the railroad over time as we start to bring up our fracking capacity, but it's not happening nearly as fast as it did before, because the frackers have learned their lesson, and they both don't want to put a lot of investment into new wells and then have the market kind of go back down, and now they're left with some uneconomic investment. So they're being a lot more cautious about adding capacity to their drilling, and so I expect the effects there to be pretty moderate, and there seems to be room on the railroad. Once they get enough crews, there's plenty of room on the railroad for any additional volume that they might get in that regard.
Thanks, Larry. And I'll just remind folks to use the Q&A or the chat if you have questions. We do have a couple more questions. What should we expect, this summer or in August when imports for holiday season hit, knowing capacity is impacted on intermodal and carload traffic?
Well, I'm a little bit out on a limb here, a lonely limb, that I think that we're nearing an inflection point that will make things feel really different. Once the system if it can just catch a little bit of breathing room here and get somewhat decongested, I guess is the term I'll use, that's going to unlock a lot of capacity. You look at cycle times, for instance, on domestic containers, and those cycle times have really stretched out. That's a function of both what's happening at the shipper dock as well as what's happening within the intermodal network. If cycle times even get halfway back to normal, that's going to unlock a tremendous amount of capacity. So I'm of the feeling that once we get a little bit of breathing room and these operations, if they can get a little bit more normalized, then a lot of this sort of bound up constipation, you could call it, in the intermodal supply chain is going to suddenly disappear. And I can't predict exactly when it's going to happen, but I think when it does happen, it's going to be quite sudden, and things are going to change in a hurry once they do start to change, once we can get the situation under control.
Yeah, and before we move off for that topic, what anything could happen, right? We talked about the challenge in trying to predict, but what might be the thing or a thing that would lead to a purge of the system like you're talking about? What?
Well, I mean, if we have enough breathing room here to eliminate the queues, and so that we can start to sort of empty out the terminals, and when I say that, just get back to a sort of a normal level of capacity utilization on terminals, and particularly on chassis, which are sort of the continual burr under the saddle here. If we can get, and that's what's happening right now inland, is again, we're back into a capacity chassis shortage situation, which is remarkable given the fact that, I just did a study here yesterday looking at international container movements from the Southwest region, which is basically LA, into the Midwest region, which is basically Chicago. And we're down year over year by double digits. And yet we're still talking about a shortage of chassis. Well, it's not a volume problem, it's a utilization problem. So if we can just sort of get that back into some semblance of normalcy, and I can, very well understand the difficulties and the reluctance to pour equipment into that situation to address a problem which is a short-term problem. So when these individual terminals, when the cycle times start to go back to normal, a lot of this difficulty is going to disappear. I don't know if that answers the question, but it's best I can do it.
Yeah. Well, we talked a little bit before the webinar started about a little softening in the spot market for truckload, and I just wonder if a much more available and interested trucking industry might take some of that, might provide some of that relief from the strain.
Well, I mean, we know that that from the share numbers that the trucking industry, normally intermodal is the safety valve for trucking when capacity gets tight. In this go around, it's been reversed. Trucking was the safety valve for intermodal. Mm-hmm. And we saw that in the lower share that intermodal is now holding on the long haul truckload market, 500 miles or more. Intermodal share decline, which is an indication of exactly what you're describing, that trucks stepped up. And we saw that in the truck rates coming out of Southern California, which went through the roof because of the demand, the capacity limitations on the intermodal side, and truck was there to sort of help fill the gap at a cost. I think that, we was chatting, the discussion of a freight recession, an imminent freight recession are vastly overdone. Mm-hmm. But it's not going to take that much of a softening for things to feel like a recession, because we're so wound up right now and capacity has been so tight. And I do think we are going to start to see some loosening. And the disconnect that we're seeing right now between the international side, where you still have all of these queues, and the domestic side, where it appears that demand, I'll say, it's normalizing a little bit, and folks are able to find the capacity that they need and are able to be a little bit more discriminating. And it's not just like, I need a truck, no matter what it costs, I need a truck, I got stuff to move. There's a disconnect right now between the international side and the domestic side, and that disconnect can't endure. Either the international side is going to have to start to reflect the same kind of conditions that the domestic side is, or vice versa. And I think it's more likely that what we're seeing on the international side is we're seeing still a completely logical pull forward of volume in time, where folks are moving volume much earlier this year in anticipation of problems. And we haven't even talked about the potential for a labor action on the West Coast here in July with the longshoremen. So stuff is moving earlier than it normally would, and that's creating these, or supporting these queues. But eventually we're going to get to the point where everything that people need is already here. And so when that happens, I think you're going to see quite a rapid change in the international Trans-Pacific situation. Stuff for the holiday season is going to move way early this year, and then it'll be done.
Yeah, the infrastructure of all the other modes are take a lot more capital, a lot more time to move than the U.S. trucking market takes time to adapt. Right. We track, as you well know, we track the number of drivers, the number of carriers, and even this month we are at the highest number of trucking companies for hire in history, and the highest number of drivers driving for hire trucking fleets in history. And and that that comes that really has been a fairly steady incline over the last decade. You had a blip in 2020, but even there ended up having a slightly. So you've got this a trucking industry that is highly adaptable, believe it or not, even though we talk about driver shortage, highly adaptable to, and in some regards over reacts, like a lot of markets do. And that could be also another one of the reasons that we're seeing the spot market start to soften, because we've got a lot more capacity out there than maybe clearly we've ever had. The question,
Go ahead.
Question was related to that, what you just mentioned, the LA Long Beach, for a lot of reasons, not just the labor, right? But excuse me, not just the labor negotiations, but also, the backlog in LA Long Beach. Shippers have been taking freight into other ports. Which of the other ports do you see taking the most volume and having the most impact, I guess, in that change?
Well, I mean, you've seen, well, just before we get to that, one comment on the driver situation. You hear these railroad CEOs and railroad executives, marketing executives, talking all the time about the driver shortage and how the driver shortage is going to drive volume to intermodal. And that is I'm sorry to say, a fantasy. The trucking industry always finds the drivers that it needs. And the only way that intermodal thrives is if it provides a good package of price and service. And any short-term dislocations like we had on the ELD crisis are just that, short-term. You might find that going for 6 months or 8 months. It's not a long-term situation. Now, with regards to the ports, you're seeing an all of the above situation there in terms of folks trying to find the easiest way inland. And so you're seeing, queues building across all of the East Coast ports and Houston in the Gulf Coast. It's basically like a balloon. You push it here, it's going to bulge out over there. So there is no, to use a phrase, there's no port in a storm. There's no place right now where folks can go in and avoid a problem. There's queues at all of the different ports. It's not as bad on the East Coast yet as it has been on the West Coast. But I think that what these guys have learned, meaning the port authorities and the terminal operators, is early in the surge, they learned the problem if they let the port get too full. So they are becoming much better at metering the ships as they come in to make sure that the terminal remains fluid. And as a result, the throughput is better than it was earlier in the crisis. And so therefore, I think these queues will be a little bit more manageable because they're not going to let the situation go into a meltdown.
Larry, thank you. We have, maybe if you could answer this one as a short answer as you can give.
I don't know how to do short answers. That's obvious.
I know. We're almost out of time, but this was the last question written that I can see here. What do you think of the UP and BNSF messages for shippers to reduce their freight? I guess that's reduce the. I'm not exactly sure what that question. Are you?
Well, I mean, the UP, there is a situation where because the railroads don't have enough crews, they're wanting to reduce the number of cars on the system in order to sort of make things more fluid. And the big difference between trucking and railroad is that if a trucker doesn't have capacity, they just turn the load down. Mm-hmm. The railroad doesn't really have that ability. And if the car is sitting there on the track, they have to deal with it. And so when there's too many cars sitting and they get in the way, you have a storage problem, just like in a port terminal. The operation tends to bog down because they can't. And so they're just trying to dig their way out of a problem that they don't have enough people. They laid off the people. They've had a very tough time bringing them back, retaining them, and being trained to run a locomotive or to be a conductor on a train on a 2-mile long train doesn't happen overnight. So they just are trying to sort of dig their way out of a problem.
Larry, thank you, and to all those folks who clicked into our webinar this afternoon and this morning, depending on where you are. Thank you for being here. We're going to wrap up 12:31 here on the East Coast. Larry again can be found at the Intermodal InDepth.com. Say that again. Intermodalindepth.com. And Larry Gross, thank you for being with us. We're going to touch on the next one is June 2nd. You see there, we're going to talk a little bit about some of what I just mentioned, where the drivers are, where the trucks are, a little bit of supply and demand, and what shippers are beginning to do, and typically what you want to begin to do if you're a shipper when you start to see the market, at least in the spot market, start to soften. We'll see if in June 2nd, the market is still there or softer or more firm, but we'll have some good strategy discussion on that call. Thank you, everyone, and this is recorded, and we will send the recording out to our attendees. Thank you all.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks.